All right, good morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to MEI's Defense Leadership Series in its sixth episode today. It's a good morning because our guest is retired Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, an impeccable soldier, but also a brilliant thinker on all things defense and security. If you think I'm exaggerating because Mike is a friend and now a member of the MEI family, just stay with us for the next hour and you'll be a judge yourself. My name is Bilal Saab. I run the Defense and Security Program at MEI, and I'm also an adjunct assistant professor with Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in the Security Studies program. The Defense Leadership Series, which is part of MEI's Defense and Security Program, is a speakers forum for current and former high-level military and defense leaders from both the United States and the Middle East, we talk about the most important policy issues facing the two sides. This series was inaugurated on June 10th, not too long ago this year, with a conversation with the U.S. Marine Corps General and Commander of CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, Frank McKenzie. Along with my colleagues, let me extend my gratitude to you, Mike, for your willingness to engage with us on some pretty important U.S. national security topics that, of course, relate to the Middle East, including the global war on terror, the great power competition, and irregular warfare. I can tell you that a large number of people have registered to listen to you, despite the fact that this is August. You do have a lot of admirers, Mike, in the policy and the military community, including myself, obviously, and the MEI family. So once again, thank you for joining me this morning, Mike, and welcome to MEI's Defense Leadership Series in this episode number 6. Over to you.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, Bilal, and hopefully my performance during this event will vindicate the generous introduction you just gave me. Thank you.
I have no doubt. Look, speaking of admirers, I have a little surprise for you, Mike. I had the pleasure of reaching out to your alma mater, Georgia State University, and I'd like to share with you a personal message from the Dean of the Lewis College of Nursing and Health Professions, Dr. Wambiao Mo. He says, and I quote, "Congratulations, Lieutenant General Nagata. Along with the physical therapy faculty and alumni, I am proud of your accomplishments. Also know that the late Professor Gordon Cummings, your PT mentor, would be pleased with your leadership and service to us all."
Thank you. That recalls something in my distant past. Some people don't know that I didn't join the military right away as a young man. I actually graduated from physical therapy school in college, even practiced for about a year before I decided I wanted a different adventure. And obviously it worked out okay, but that's very kind of you. Thank you.
No problem. Well, I can't wait to start this conversation, Mike, but let me briefly introduce you and invite you all, please, to check out Mike's full bio on the MEI website. Mike is a distinguished senior fellow on national security with the MEI. He's had a long and distinguished career in the U.S. military and the U.S. government. He retired after serving in the U.S. Army for 38 years, 34 of those as a special operations officer. His final government position was Director of Strategic Planning for the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center, that's NCTC, from 2016 to 2019. Mike deployed in multiple contingency and combat special operations and campaigns across 3 continents, including East and North Africa, the Middle East, and Central and South Asia. He also served in both strategy and policy positions in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, 2 assignments in the U.S. intelligence community, and extensive service at diplomatic posts of the United States abroad, including in Pakistan. Boy, they give you the easy ones, right? Today, he's a strategic advisor and senior vice president for CACI International. That's in Arlington, Virginia. He's also the owner of Hanada Bridge, which is a consulting firm. Very relevant to this morning's topic, Mike is also the commander, was the commander of CENTCOM Special Operations Command, aka SOCCENT. In that role, he was responsible for special operations across the CENTCOM region from 2013 to 2015. and he was heavily involved in the first 2 years of combat operations against the Islamic State in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere. And I'll conclude by saying that Mike has degrees from Georgia State University and the National War College. Mike, what else do we need to know about you?
Well, I think like many of the people on the call, I am learning anew what it means to be in direct line of sight tasking of my family members 24 hours a day.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you a few questions here. Probably each will require conventions and conferences to answer, but I'm going to ask you to do that for 5 minutes each, I guess, which is very fair, right? I'll start with this, and I'm going to leverage your experience, Mike, in counterterrorism, right? The last position that you held in government, both on the ground as an official with policy responsibilities. We have been officially at least, at war with violent extremism for almost 20 years, right? Yet we've barely been able to dent it, from Al-Qaeda to the Islamic State. Tell us, what is the trajectory of this movement, of this phenomenon, and how should we define success?
That's a great opening question. I'm going to try to do this in a reasonably organized way, but let me give you the bottom line first. The bottom line is the trajectory of all forms of violent extremism, not just the kind that are associated with organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. All forms of violent extremism everywhere around the world are rising and diversifying, which is a troubling trend, but it's been going on for quite a while. If we're honest with ourselves, the growth in violent extremism internationally has been growing for decades, long before 9/11 happened. That trend, unfortunately, continues. But I think perhaps a more practical way of answering, hopefully this doesn't sound like I'm dodging the question, is to answer the question, how are we doing? Or I'll recast it slightly. When I was the director for strategic operational planning at NCTC, I was very often asked, Nagata, are we winning? And I learned to answer that question, even though it may sound like a dodge, by asking a different question. What do you mean by winning? And in my view, one of our biggest problems in the US counterterrorism community itself, as well as just the United States government more broadly for many years, has been we're very inconsistent and sometimes rather vague about what it is we're trying to accomplish. Now, there are at least three reasonable responses to the question, what do we mean by winning? The first one is we're never going to have another 9/11. Now, that's a rather American-centric response, but it's an understandable response given how horrific that day was.
Right.
If that's our measure of success, then I suppose we're winning because we haven't had another 9/11. The problem with that answer is terrorist groups and terrorist individuals keep trying. So we're endlessly having to prevent another 9/11. So it's an unsatisfying answer. Another one is that we've become much more effective at using mostly law enforcement and military tools to attack or to arrest or otherwise remove terrorist groups, terrorist individuals around the world. By that measure, we're winning as well. When I consider as a special forces officer how we once did these kinds of operations when 9/11 happened and how we do it today, perhaps best exemplified by the long-range raids that killed both Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, a few months ago. We have made staggering improvements in our ability to use law enforcement and military tools. It's been, at least in the military area, this is one arena where I actually think the overused term revolution in military affairs actually applies. Our ability to find, fix, finish terrorists wherever they may be around the world is unprecedented. But it's an unsatisfying answer because the number of terrorists keeps growing. So the final one, which I personally am a fan of, is that the world, not just the United States, the world has become much more effective at preventing people from ever becoming terrorists to begin with. By that measure, we are not winning, because like every statistical indicator I've ever seen for the last 2 decades indicates there are more terrorists today than there were on 9/11. By that standard, we're losing. So I guess I'll finish by just saying, overall, the trajectory, as I've already indicated, is rising and broadening. It's diversifying. There are more types of terrorists today than there were before. Unfortunately, that includes within the United States. The variation in violent extremist individuals and groups inside the United States is steadily growing. Some of them are religiously inspired, some of them are societally inspired, some of them are ethnically or racially inspired, but they are growing and diversifying. So I'll finish just by saying, I think if we demonstrated anything in the last 20 years, that while it is important to have the ability to either arrest or otherwise do away with a violent terrorist who is about to kill someone, in other words, we've become much better at saving people's lives. That will always be important. But what we've learned is that kind of instrumentality and that kind of approach does not reduce the scale of terrorism.
Okay. Well, why don't we just stay on that topic of prevention, because it's certainly an important one, and it's a big element of the whole enterprise, right? So I think, as you said, most of our resources and attention go to countering terrorism. I think a tiny fraction of that goes into prevention. So first question is why? Have we given up on the prevention business? Is it too damn complicated? And how do you strike a balance between supporting those underdeveloped nations that are, undergoing terrorism problems, but at the same time avoiding nation building, because you know how allergic we have become to the whole concept of nation building, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to extend a little bit based on the remarks I just gave you, because the question you just asked me is an extension of the original question. So at the risk of repeating myself, most of our attention for the last 20 years, particularly in the United States, has gone into the kinds of capabilities, the kinds of resources, the kinds of skills necessary to save lives. And that's incredibly important because so many lives are at risk. It could be a hostage we need to rescue. It might be a terrorist leader that needs to be done away with to damage the command and control structure in a terrorist element. It could be a lot of different things, but that's the use of physical force to save lives at the end of the day. That's not the same thing as defeating terrorism. That's preventing terrorists from killing people. That's a subset of defeating terrorism. It's not the whole enchilada. The whole enchilada is really about figuring out, not just as the United States, but as an international community, why do people become terrorists and what can be done to reduce the likelihood that a vulnerable individual or a vulnerable group takes the path of initially radicalization, but ultimately mobilization to violence. And this is an important distinction, particularly in democracies like ours, where holding a radical view is constitutionally protected in the United States. And in most developed democracies, holding a radical idea is protected one way or another. It's okay. You can believe whatever you want to believe. You just can't conduct an act of violence. Now, one of the things I studied as hard as I could the 3 years I was at the National Counterterrorism Center is the question you posed. As a practical matter, how much policy support, how many people, and how much money is allocated to this very broad, complex topic of figuring out how to prevent vulnerable individuals and groups from taking the path to violent extremism? And I doubt you or anyone in the listening audience will be shocked to know that it is a tiny fraction of the amount of money that gets allocated to something I've already indicated is very important, saving lives. The problem is we're dramatically out of balance. And we have been dramatically out of balance on this question for 2 decades now, at least, where the vast preponderance of our policy and resource emphasis goes to saving lives which I vote for. I vote for saving lives. I've personally been involved in operations that whose objective was to save people's lives. But in a way, we've kind of turned a blind eye to an equally, if not more important endeavor, which is to take this very difficult journey to answer the question, why do people become terrorists? And what does it take to prevent them without violating their privacy, violating their rights, or doing other unintended forms of harm? We are wafer thin in terms of policy support, resources, and I'll finish by just emphasizing one thing that I suspect some in your audience may be a little surprised by. I won't be surprised if some disagree with me. But in the 3 years I studied this at NCTC, one of the things I learned is the amount of empirical research that has been published that answers the question, why do people become terrorists? Mm-hmm. And then the follow-on question of what are effective regimes and approaches for mm-hmm. preventing them from becoming terrorists. That amount, the volume of empirical research on these two related questions is wafer thin. It's shockingly thin. Yep. Until we redress that, we're going to be guilty of an age-old problem. We're going to try to solve a problem we don't understand. Yeah.
I mean, you said it's an international effort, specifically as we discuss the issue of prevention. Obviously, this is not something that we can do on our own. So why don't we just talk about that a little bit? And obviously, there's a very important role here to be played by some partners of ours in the Middle East, our Arab partners, that could very much help us out in this space. What expectations should we have regarding the roles and responsibilities? Do they exacerbate this problem? Or do we have to strike a balance once again between securing their cooperation on the hard stuff, hard business of countering terrorists and arresting and killing, and at the same time not alienating them and pushing them too far on the issues that very much have relevance to violent extremism, which have to do with, of course, societal reform and economics and politics. Easy questions, right, Mike?
Yes, I think there are 2 or 3 PhD theses embedded in the questions you just asked me. Right. But I'll try to be brief about this. First of all, when it comes to the approach by the United States to this particular region of the world, the Middle East, and the varied populations that live within it, but as everyone knows, the vast majority of them practicing the Muslim faith. And this is one of the jobs I had at the National Counterterrorism Center, was try to see ourselves, see what is our own strategic approach to regions like this. And one of the conclusions I came to is that the United States, for all its good intentions, has been very inconsistent and highly variable in the way it has tried to deal with these entangled problems of the strategic importance of the Middle East, the political fault lines, challenges, complexities, and failures within the Middle East, and then, of course, the incredibly diverse population of the Middle East. We have enormous difficulty as a government sticking to a consistent approach. And therefore, at the risk of oversimplifying this, we often get the results that anyone can get when it's trying to solve a problem, but every 24 hours, that person completely changes their approach to how they're trying to solve the problem. The likelihood is that person is not going to get very far because he keeps changing their approach. He keeps changing his approach, I should say. Now, what do I mean by that? What I believe I've seen over the last 2 decades in particular is, on the one hand, the United States government will acknowledge and recognize the strategic importance of the Middle East. And that's everything from the petroleum production that comes out of the Middle East all the way to the iron reality that the Middle East is a geographic nexus or hinge point between the continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Transit between these 3 continents requires, in large measure, either transiting the ground or the airspace of the Middle East. So it is inevitably important simply because of its geographic location. And so we'll recognize all it, and we will do, the typical American word is we will engage. We will try to engage productively. We will try to engage in ways that secure our long-term interests, the interests of our allies and our partners around the world, the free flow of oil, et cetera. But then what happens is that we, the United States, we become very frustrated. We can become very frustrated with a myriad of things: how long it takes, how complex it is, how, in our language, this is our language, how, quote, unreliable our allies and partners in the Middle East can be from time to time. We often forget that they will levy the same accusation at us, that we are unreliable just as much. And eventually we get so frustrated that we say, we're done with this. These people just need to clean up their own backyards. We've got other things to do. And we tell ourselves we're going to walk away, or at least we're going to care less and we're going to do less. I don't know how many times I've seen US administrations out of frustration, understandable frustration, but basically cop this attitude that, we're done. We're going to care less, we're going to do less. But the Middle East has a very, very effective way of reminding countries like the United States, who have aspirations to be global powers and have global influence, that the Middle East freaking matters. And so what happens is we will walk away for a little while, almost like, we've decided we're done with a relationship with someone, only to discover that person is still important to us. And then we come rushing back, begging back to be let back in the relationship. I'm sure there are many practitioners and policymakers who might be listening to me who think I'm exaggerating here, but I think I've seen this behavior pattern of trying to walk away from the Middle East and then come rushing back when we realize it still matters to us. I think I've seen this 5 or 6 times over my career.
Well, why don't we just actually touch on that issue, since now we have a new top priority in foreign policy, right? Which is the great power competition. We seem to have de-emphasized, formally at least, the issue of countering terrorism, and now we have elevated to the very top this concept of the great power competition. We have shifted our attention to the Far East, as you very well know, Mike, and caused drastic adjustments in our national security bureaucracy. This is no joke. But I want to go back to the very concept itself. In my judgment, it just remains a little bit ill-defined. Its parameters unclear, and so is the approach. I mean, how just on an intellectual level, how should we understand this great power competition? Is it kinetic? Is it irregular? Is it all of the above? And of course, I want you to add the Middle East into this puzzle, as you just started yourself. But why don't we just start with the concept itself? How do you view that? Are we doing a good job of actually explaining it to all those who are involved in it right now in the US government?
Great question. And this is something that I have been studying as hard as I can for the last few years, but I cannot claim to be an expert in this. It's such a complex arena, but I'll try to answer your question more directly than that. In my judgment, in my opinion, what we are seeing around the world is a rising contest or competition, if you will, over strategic influence among so-called great powers. Everybody's got a stake in this, whether they're great or smaller powers. But the most obvious layer of this is the so-called great power competition. So that's the United States, Russia, China. But it is in many ways an almost breathtaking level of global competition. But fundamentally, it's for influence. It's influence over what people believe, influence over what people value, and influence over the choices that they make that are based on what they believe and what they value. Okay. For a very long time, I think if the United States is honest with itself, ever since World War II, the United States had unprecedented influence over what people believed, what people valued, and the choices that they make that flowed from both, because of our standing as not only the at least nominal leader of the effort that brought down Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but also the benefits we derived, the reputation we derived from the years of struggle against the old Soviet Union, where ultimately the United States and its allies emerged triumphant from that. So we have had outsized influence over what people believe, what people value, and the decisions they made for decades. But all of that now is being eroded, and it's being very effectively eroded by actors like Russia or China, despite the fact that they are in many ways pale shadows of the material or military power that we have. China is obviously starting to rival us economically, but and it begs the question, why? Why are comparatively weaker powers able to contest us so effectively in the arena of influence? Well, I think the answer to that lies in very common human experiences, where the most persuasive actor, regardless of how much physical or material power they may have, the most persuasive actor emerges triumphant. And in too many cases these days, countries like Russia or China are proving to be more persuasive than the United States or our closest allies. Now, there are many reasons for that. I'm not gonna go on endlessly here because I know there are other questions you want to get to, but just off the top of my head, there are 2 or 3 particular reasons that jump out at me that these comparatively weaker actors like Russia or China are being more persuasive than the United States. Number one, they're more consistent than we are. Right. They identify an approach and they stick with it. We tend to be highly variable in our approach. And that inconsistency makes us less effective. Number 2, we often do more talking than listening. As much as I may not admire what Russia or China are trying to accomplish, sometimes they do a better job of listening to local populations than we do. And that makes them more persuasive. Third, we tend to be much less risk tolerant than Russia or China. There are many things that China or Russia do. I got to see this firsthand when Russia came back into the Middle East while we were trying to deal with ISIS. There are many things the Russians tried to do that didn't work very well the first few times they did them, but they were relentless in trying new things. And eventually you keep trying new things, you'll find something that works. In other words, they were willing to accept the risks of constant failure in order to succeed. That risk tolerance is in very short supply in the United States government. We are rather risk intolerant. In order to succeed in a complex endeavor like great power competition, you have to be risk tolerant because you don't know what's going to work in every situation. And like the old saying goes, the only way you learn how to succeed is learn how to fail. Right. Our willingness to fail, our willingness to experiment is not as strong as it ought to be. And finally, I'll just tell you, I've heard a lot of talk over the last several years, including before I retired, about, listen, because of great power competition, we're going to have to do less when it comes to counterterrorism. The problem with that is terrorists won't let you ignore them. Right. The political consequences of successful terrorist attacks are so large that I am very dubious about any government's assertions that, we're going to have to care less about violent extremism. That'll be true until the day people die. And then suddenly you'll have to go rushing back to pay attention to it, and you'll regret ever walking away from it. In my humble opinion, the United States has got to learn to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Yes, great power competition is a rising strategic threat to the United States, and we need to get better at that. But if we turn our back on terrorism, it won't last very long. I'll tell you, I'll end with a rather funny little story. It's very short. When I was on the joint staff and the previous administration was going through the so-called pivot to Asia. Right. And we had actually reduced the special operations presence in Africa in some ways in order to accommodate the pivot to Asia. Right. And then Benghazi happened.
Uh-huh.
And not only did everything we had removed from Africa had to go back, we end up with more assets in Africa than we started with. So the joke on the Joint Staff was, it's not the pivot to Asia, it's the 360-degree pivot to Asia. We ended up right where we started.
Now, I've seen that movie before. I think we have returned to Saudi Arabia after a 17-year hiatus, right? You mentioned that your colleagues and perhaps superiors at NCTC used to ask you, are we winning? I mean, can't you imagine that same exact question being asked today by people in the government regarding the great power competition? I mean, this thing is so open-ended that, and as you said yourself, is very different from what we experienced in the Cold War, when we could, in many ways, see light at the end of the tunnel, given the very significant faults and flaws of the Soviet system, right? We were on some level confident that this was not going to be sustainable. Not to mention that we actually had an effective strategy, right, of containment. This is different. And so if you ask yourself the same question, how does this end? It must be frustrating and exhausting and quite taxing in terms of resources, in terms of bandwidth, to engage in this pursuit and have some kind of expectation that we are A, doing well, B, that there's a chance that we actually might win, regardless of what we mean by victory, because this is a very different kettle of fish. We live in a very interconnected world. Our economies are interdependent. They're on the rise as opposed to being, where the Soviet Union was, at least in the 80s, right? So are we back to the same question, like, are we winning? How do we win?
There are similarities, but there are some substantial differences, but I'll focus on the similarities for starters. I think a fair argument can be made that the Cold War was a very long-term strategic contest over influence between the Soviet bloc and the Western world. Ultimately, the Western world prevailed, and the Soviet Union, of course, dissolved itself. That said, there was this harbinger of nuclear conflict
Right.
on top of the Cold War that in many ways, at least in my judgment, in many ways made an outcome in favor of the West more likely, because the idea of resorting to nuclear warfare was just so unthinkable for both sides that there was a general willingness to find another way than risk annihilation, mutual annihilation. So when I look at great power competition, it does have a disadvantage in that there is not this sort of Damocles hanging over great power competition there was the way over the Cold War. I mean, yes, China, Russia, the United States all have nuclear weapons, but there's not much discussion. There's not much deliberation about the possibility that great power competition is going to end up in a nuclear holocaust. It's not impossible, I suppose, but it doesn't seem to be weighing on people's minds very much. This really has come down, as I've indicated earlier, I think, to a global contest over influence that where there are going to be winners and losers. Now, right now, my appraisal of the situation is American influence became so high since the end of World War II that US influence broadly is still better and stronger and more pervasive than even the combination of Russia and China. But the delta between those two amounts of influence is shrinking. It's shrinking every year. It is foreseeable that if trends continue, eventually the influence, certainly of Russia and China in combination, and perhaps particularly in the case of China individually might someday surpass the amount of strategic influence the United States has. Now, in my judgment, it'll still be a few years before that happens, but the trend lines are not favorable to the United States right now. The good news is, because that intersection has not yet happened, there's still time and space for the United States to, first of all, halt the erosion of US influence around the world, stabilize it, and then do the hardest thing of all, turn things around to begin regaining strategic influence that we have lost. All three will be difficult. All three, in my judgment, will take multiple US government administrations to execute. It reminds me a little bit of George Kennan's exhortation in the long telegram at the outset of the Cold War, where he essentially was making the argument, this is a generational struggle. The United States has to figure out a way to do this consistently for decades, regardless of what political administration is in power, or we're never going to get there. I would argue that the same formula, obviously there'll be huge differences in the contents of the formula, but the same approach is going to be necessary now, because the erosion of American influence and standing around the world is happening right before our very eyes. Yep. The last thing I'll say about this is that right now, in my personal opinion, and I'm no longer in government right now, so nobody has to take me seriously, but right now, as I've tried to examine where the bulk of US government attention, effort, and investment are going, yep, it's in an important and necessary arena, but it may not be the most important. And that is getting ready to prepare for the possibility that an armed conflict arises between the so-called great powers. Now that's important. Right. That's important. It's important not just in practical terms, because if God forbid it were to happen, we need to win that conflict, but also there's a deterrent value in making sure that our military and intelligence capabilities are better and increasingly better than anything China or Russia can do. But we're so hyper-focused on that frankly, we're not paying enough attention to the day-to-day strategic struggle that occurs far away from Russia and far away from China, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Western Hemisphere, where this contest for influence between these three powers, particularly between the United States and China, that is mostly happening in the digital world and the economic world, because the two are intrinsically entangled. We're not paying enough attention to that. And because we're not paying enough attention at that, we are at the risk of being strategically outflanked, because we're so hyper-focused on being militarily ready for a contest with a Russia or China that basically we're being end-run in the digital and economic worlds by the same comparatively weak actors. And we could be strategically defeated that way if we let ourselves stay in this current posture.
Talk about tools a little bit, see what we have in that toolbox to effectively prosecute this great power competition. And specifically, I'm talking about the geographic combatant commands. So if we're going to do this on a global scale, then obviously everybody's going to have to be involved, all hands on deck, right? And so my question to you, Mike, is it time for a reorganization, reconfiguration, reconceptualization of how we conceive and use our geographic combatant commands? I mean, once again, this is happening on a global scale. So why then is the shift to the Indo-Pacific happening probably at the expense of other key regions, such as the Middle East? Is that wise? I mean, if the Chinese are more, I think I wrote that along with General Blotel in a recent piece, if the Chinese are more effective with their plans and goals in the Middle East, doesn't that make them more comfortable in the Indo-Pacific and vice versa? Why should there be a greater attention to one specific region, but at the expense of another, if we're going to do this on a global scale? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll start. I'll come back to the geographic combatant commands in a moment, but I can't resist saying that, in my opinion, the United States and several of its allies should reconsider the approach we have taken so far, at least in my view, the approach we have taken so far regarding China's Belt and Road Initiative. Because our tendency has been to try to heap rhetorical scorn on the Belt and Road Initiative, which I suppose has some value, but not a lot. And we should recognize, we typically try to castigate it as a hollow, superficial, economic extortion kind of strategic initiative that nobody should believe in. And what we fail to acknowledge, and I think almost at an intellectual level, we fail to recognize, is that for many of these countries that have become participants in the Belt and Road Initiative, it's the best offer they've got.
Yep.
And it begs the question, well, what is America offering me that's better than the Belt and Road Initiative? I get it that it may be hollow and there may be, economic extortion involved here, but I'm desperate. I'm in desperate straits. I've got a population clamoring for improvements. I want to stay in office. What choice do I have? Heaping scorn on the Belt and Road Initiative is not the same thing as effectively competing with the Belt and Road Initiative, but that would require us getting over something. And it would require us getting over the fact that securing our interests around the world is expensive. Yep. and complicated, and in some case, dangerous and risky, both physically and politically. Now, all that said, we also suffer from some structural problems. As I think most people know, the current combatant command structure in the Department of Defense and much else that doesn't get as much attention across the United States government is a function of both the original National Security Act of 1947 that created much of the structure that we currently have when it comes to national security, but it's a series of amendments. For the military, probably the most important one was the Goldwater-Nichols Act in the 1980s that created the geographic combatant commands that your original question referred to.
Yep.
Is it time for a change? Absolutely. But I would argue that, unfortunately, that need for change is not restricted to the type or the quantity of combatant commands we have in the United States military. That's important, but in some ways, it's not the most important change that we need to consider.
Okay.
If there was ever a time in our nation's history where we need to take the old worn out term of whole of government approaches to complex problems, if there was ever a time we needed that in reality, it is now. In a world of great power competition where so much of the contest is not happening on a military or physical battlefield. So much of it is happening in contests against things like Belt and Road initiatives, or what do people believe? What do people value? What are their personal practices and decisions that come from these beliefs and values in a complex arena like the Middle East? Has nothing to do with the use of physical force and everything to do with economies and societal conditions and political toxicity or health, depending on what country you live in. In my humble opinion, what we need is to take the idea of COCOMs, which was, as I think everybody knows, a law that compelled the four services of the US military, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, to care more about working together than working independently. To place teamwork among and between the services being more important than service identity. We need that now across the executive branch of the United States government. Now, I'm going to use an overused term, and I suspect there will be people say, hey, listen, I've seen this movie, it doesn't work. But the idea of joint and interagency constructs, time is now. But I'm not hearing a loud call either in political or national security circles for this. And unfortunately, there are some significant disabilities that impede our ability to do something that I would argue is necessary. A more consistent and integrated approach by all the agencies of the United States government. And the one that alarms me the most, at other MEI events, you probably heard me say this, I get asked, what concerns me most about the United States government right now? I have one answer for that. It is the continual hollowing out of the foreign service of the US State Department. I find that to be the single most alarming trend in national security today. And without a stronger foreign service, the idea of more cohesive coherent and effective interagency approaches against these increasingly complex problems, in my humble opinion, is impossible.
I thought you got the memo, Mike, that we're just not allowed to have nice things. Whole of government is like the ultimate unicorn, but that doesn't mean that it's less important. So I hear you.
It can happen. Yeah, I've seen islands of excellence where it has happened. It's just not fashionable.
Right, right. Okay, let's take it a level a little bit down from the strategic and maybe more to tactical, operational. I want to leverage your experience in SOF. You've served for most of your career as a special operations officer. Is SOF the way to go when we discuss and conduct security cooperation in the Middle East? Should we keep things niche and specific and achievable and narrow, as opposed to building large-scale militaries and failing as we've done so often? Should we keep things small?
Oh my goodness. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, yes. But I know you know this, Bilal. It begs a larger question, though. What are we trying to accomplish? You know, what's the nature of the problem we're trying to solve? Have we accurately characterized it?
Yeah.
So whether it's in the Middle East or any other part of the world, can we actually characterize the problem we're trying to solve accurately? That's hard enough. But if you can characterize the problem that you're trying to solve reasonably well, then the decisions about the size of your effort, the kinds of tools, instruments, and people needed for the effort become much easier to determine. Unfortunately, and you know this very well, too often what happens in our government and governments everywhere is, instead of starting with the what exactly is the problem we're trying to solve, we start with, here are all my preferred approaches regardless of what we're trying to solve.
Right.
And SOF, I would not argue special operations forces are unique in this regard, but we're often an instrument that is employed not because a policymaker has made a rational calculation that the nature of this problem requires this instrument, but rather the start point was, I really like employing this instrument, and surely if I throw this instrument at that problem, they'll find a way to solve it. I don't know what that's like. I mean, I'm trying to think of a household analogy. That would be like going to my toolbox, randomly picking up a screwdriver,
Yep.
and then going outside to fix a jumbo jet. It's the wrong tool for the problem I have, but I'm so in love with the screwdriver, I picked it up anyways. That's a rather ridiculous analogy, but sometimes it feels that way. Now, I'm not arguing that special operations forces shouldn't be employed, but the decision-making calculus that employs special operations forces is not always rational. Sometimes it's highly emotional and based on personal preference.
Yeah.
In my humble opinion, after 34 years in special operations, I think special operations forces are particularly designed to be employed in situations where there's a highly complex problem. It can be complex technically, it can be complex physically, it can be complex because it's highly dangerous. You can die trying to solve the problem. Yeah. Or there are just other people's lives on the line. That makes it complex as well. So it's very complex. It's in an environment that the United States government is not well suited to understand. And we need people who are deliberately selected, recruited, trained, and developed to be problem solvers in those kinds of environments. That, in my humble opinion, is what special operations forces are for. And those kinds of things do happen quite frequently. This combination of highly complex, potentially very dangerous, an environment we don't understand very well, and we need people to go into that environment we don't understand very well and solve that problem. Special operations forces are ideally suited for that, particularly when we want to have a small footprint. because special operations forces operate in relatively small elements and teams. Unfortunately, special operations forces in some ways have become victims of their own success.
Right.
And we've been good, not perfect. We've certainly screwed up from time to time, but we've been so good at doing what I've just described that in many ways we've become the easy button.
Yeah. And
this is a failure, frankly, of self-discipline at the policymaker level, in my humble opinion. Just because something has delivered a great deal of satisfaction to you in very difficult, complex circumstances should not mean that the next problem that hurtles into your inbox means you just automatically reach for that tool and apply it, because it may be a terrible mismatch.
That's right.
Now that said, special operations forces are not guilt-free here. We sometimes in special operations forces, at the risk of offending my former colleagues who are still on active duty, sometimes we don't exhibit our own form of self-discipline. And when the policymaker says, hey, we want you to go do this, sometimes our answer should say, with all due respect, of course, we will follow any order given, but are you sure we're the right instrument for this problem? Yeah. Because now that we've examined what you're asking us to do, where and for what reason, there may be other instrumentalities, other agencies, other organizations that are more likely to succeed than we are. But sometimes we can be adrenaline junkies. Oh, put me in, coach, I'll figure it out. We should be more disciplined than that.
Let's talk about one of those failures, actually. Now that you're retired, you're probably going to write your memoirs and refer to an episode that you probably want to forget, but I have to talk to you about it, which is Syria. The brief question is, what the hell happened in Syria? And if you could share with the audience, your personal involvement in that earlier effort of train and equip with the Syrian rebels. Of course, we learned a ton from that afterwards, and we got a lot better. But what happened there? And could you share with us your own experience at that moment?
Well, first of all, I'm never going to write my memoirs because it'll go straight into the humor and comedy section.
I'll read it.
But you're asking me a fair question, and the adventure that I and my colleagues once had in Syria is something I'll continue to muse about and think about, I suspect, till my dying day. So maybe you should ask me this question 20 years from now. I may actually have a more coherent answer. But I think in the limited time we have here, I think I'll try to convey three brief things. Number one, and this may sound like I'm just trying to be self-deprecating here or falsely humble, and I'm attempting neither here. One of the problems that the United States government suffered from is the fact that I was put in charge of the train and equip program. I mean, the number of failures I was guilty of in those first 2 years of trying to raise an effective fighting force are legion. I still haven't completely emotionally or psychologically reconciled myself with all the things I got wrong. So I wanted to start with that admission. It may sound phony, it may sound facile, but I honestly do believe that. Number two, it was, in my humble opinion, it was a textbook example, not just of myself, but my colleagues, U.S. government policymakers, of expecting almost, or at least hoping for almost magical results for essentially paltry investments. What we essentially were trying to do was create an effective fighting force out of Syrian volunteers that could close with and destroy what essentially was a very powerful ISIS army. And I don't use that term lightly. It was a well-organized, well-led, firepower-rich army. This is 2014, 2015. This was ISIS at its highest zenith.
Exactly.
That it could effectively close with and destroy, obviously with the support of US air power and other forms of assistance from outside, but that could over time become large enough, competent enough, brave enough, well-led enough that it could close with and destroy in a major military campaign the army of ISIS that existed in Syria. Now, I will go to my grave believing that was not impossible. In fact, we ultimately did find a way to do it. Of course, it required me to depart the stage in order for that solution to be found. We effectively did it, but when you compare the amount of resources and policy support that were given to our Syrian volunteers in the early couple of years compared to what we were willing to provide the Syrian democratic forces that ultimately destroyed the geographic elements of ISIS inside of Syria, there's no comparison. We unfortunately, we had to learn the hard way. I suspect future historians will look back on this and think, what were the Americans thinking in those first 2 years? This tiny amount of money, this policy prohibition against putting any advisors on the ground to work alongside these Syrian volunteers, the very limited amount of air power that was provided. How did they imagine that was going to work? The good news is they finally did figure it out. They finally allowed people to be put on the ground. They substantially increased the amount of resources and firepower that were allocated, and the density of the air cover that was provided. The Syrian Democratic Forces in the last 2 years of the campaign were breathtaking. Historians will look back on that and think, why did the Americans have to learn this lesson? Well, unfortunately, it's because people like me were in charge in the first 2 years.
Oh, stop it. I'm sure there's a whole lot of nuggets that you want to share with us about that experience, but we'll just leave it at that for now. I've got one more question, Mike, and then I want to take two from colleagues who have emailed me in advance, if you don't mind. I know we're live streaming here and no one's allowed to ask questions, but two of them are actually quite proactive and
certainly
emailed me in advance asking a couple. So if you don't mind, maybe we'll just go a little bit over 11 o'clock. Is that okay?
I am at your disposal.
Gotcha. So I'll ask one last one, and then I'll turn it over to those two questions. Civil-military relations. I want to address one specific point. So as our capabilities of providing civilian leadership with live feeds of military operations on the ground in some very far away lands, right? How do we instill better discipline in the system? How do you invite strategic guidance without jeopardizing the tactical mission and alienating the generals, right? And you're seeing a lot of those examples now in this information age. We saw what happened in Abbottabad, right? And then the many other examples that we're just are not aware of. But how do you strike that balance nowadays?
Well, this answer is going to sound a little glib. I don't mean to be glib, but it'll probably come across that way to some of the audience. We need more effective efforts at developing better leadership habits among more senior officials in the United States government.
How do you do that?
And the reason I'm answering that way is because I accept what I consider to be an absolute fact, that the emergence of the digital universe we now live in, that's only getting stronger and more pervasive, and the ability of anyone on the planet to be able to examine anything happening anywhere in the world in real time, in high definition, where you can see literally everything that is happening down to the tiniest detail, that's only going to get better and better and better and better. There seems to be no end to how much this is going to improve.
Right.
So what I didn't start with, because I don't think it's conceivable, I don't think it's achievable, is the idea that we can somehow limit the ability of any policymaker in any government to be able to examine in real time what is happening at the smallest level of detail in the tactical implementation of anything from a military to a foreign service military officer, foreign service officer, FBI, legal, I don't care who they are. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if in the next few years, we've got every ambassador wearing a body cam. I'm sure that's making all the foreign service people have a heart attack as they listen to you say that, but it wouldn't shock me because those technologies are becoming more and more available.
Yeah.
And I just think the trend is unstoppable. So the ability of a very senior official, like in Washington, D.C., or in any capital anywhere, to be able to watch in real time tactical execution down to the finest level of detail. That's unstoppable. But the question before us is, how do we ensure that that doesn't result in an endless series of something that I suspect every person on the call here has personally experienced one way or another? Suddenly, if you're the tactical implementer in the field, suddenly discovering the 10,000-mile screwdriver has arrived and is going to completely recalibrate everything you've been trying to accomplish without any of the comprehension of how complex the environment actually is for you.
Right.
In my humble opinion, the only answer for that is to make stronger investments in leadership training and development to inculcate a cultural norm that does not exist today. At least it's not pervasive today among our most senior leaders of the United States government, that basically instructs them and persuades them, just because you can reach across the ocean with your 10,000-mile screwdriver and try to alter what the practitioner is trying to do doesn't mean you should. In fact, you should accept the risk associated with not tampering with it than to take the risk of trying to change it. Because at the end of the day, experience proves that trying to change it from Washington, D.C. is much worse in the long run than letting it go. But right now, that's not the trend we're on.
That's a fair answer. That's a fair answer. I lied, Mike. I got one more. I'm sorry, but this is going to be a really brief one. Our biggest nemesis in Iraq and elsewhere where we've been deployed was IEDs. Nowadays, it's drones. Is that a fair characterization of the next challenge? And obviously, I'm speaking of precise, lethal drones. Is that our biggest nemesis right now on the battlefield?
I think it is the most obvious manifestation of the next challenge. It's the in-our-face aspect of a much larger problem, in my humble opinion. Unmanned aerial systems are a very visible facet, a very visible face of a much larger phenomenon, which is the blistering improvements and spread of increasingly powerful digital technologies.
That's right.
A drone is essentially a flying robot that increasingly, as I'm sure you've heard from other speakers like General McKenzie, are increasingly unmanned. In other words, there's no human pilot. What drone users everywhere are discovering is that the human pilot is becoming the limiting factor. And these things would fly faster, be more precise, be more agile, be much more survivable if there was no human pilot, because artificial intelligence is getting stronger and stronger and stronger with every year. But so much of the human race now lives in what some people call the electromagnetic spectrum. This is the world of 5G, of cyber, the internet, of the benefits that we derive from space-based platform. I mean, soon, if you have a relative that lives in some rural area, they're going to be able to get, very high-speed internet access because so many commercial companies are throwing up near Earth and low Earth orbiting satellite constellations. They're going to be able to stream high bandwidth internet service no matter where you are anywhere in the world. These are incredibly powerful technologies that are completely remaking the face of human civilization, how people live their lives, how people practice their cultural traditions, how people do business. This is the single most important and most powerful change happening in human history, I believe. And so drones are just an obvious manifestation of that. But think about this for a second. Drones right now mostly are human piloted, but as I've already alluded to, are increasingly going to be unmanned because they'll just be better when they're unmanned. When we take human pilots out of the loop, they'll be much more effective. Right. But imagine a world where these flying artificially intelligent robots start to converge with other capabilities, where these flying artificially intelligent robots will not just be able to communicate with terrestrial systems, they'll be able to communicate with space-based systems. They'll be able to become part of the 5G network, which is, I agree with the technologists who say that the advent of 5G cellular systems is going to change the face of mankind. As these technologies converge, and many technologies that we haven't even mentioned this call, as these technologies increasingly converge with each other, in my humble opinion, it's going to remake human civilization. Is the United States government adequately considering the implications on these blistering technology changes on how we practice national security? I think the rather obvious answer to that is no. It's not that nobody's considering it, but this is not at the forefront of the national security dialogues that I see. It's kind of an afterthought right now. We will regret that someday.
Yeah. I certainly want to be respectful of your time and also of people who are listening and who have joined us. But let me ask the final two from colleagues who have emailed in advance, like I said. One is from Missy Ryan from the Washington Post, and one is from Rita Husseini, a postgraduate from Georgetown University. Missy is asking you, what do you think the role of SOF entities like SOCCENT and JSOC will be as the US military shifts toward great power competition? So that's Missy. And then Rita asks, in terms of US policy towards the Middle East, what have you seen, Mike, as the most consequential and nuanced changes over successive administrations that may not be immediately obvious to the American public? So let's just start with.
Okay, I'm just writing that down so I don't forget. Okay, in terms of Missy's question, in many ways, I think I've already answered her question, but I'll be brief in repeating it. If my diagnosis is correct, that great power competition is primarily a contest over strategic influence.
Yep.
Not that there might not be some degree of armed conflict in the midst of it. I hope not, but it's conceivable. There might be some level of armed conflict in it. But I think mostly it's a war for influence that may or may not involve military power. I think the answer to her question lies in a slightly different question. To what degree are small teams and elements that are tailor-made to go into highly complex environments, sometimes even denied complex environments, and solve incredibly complex problems despite the relatively small size of the force. To whatever degree that is necessary in great power competition, SOF is relevant. Now, as I examine the nature of how great power competition is manifesting itself these days, if you take, for example, what happened in the Crimea and the Ukraine, one thing is certain. The Russians used their special operations forces incredibly effectively in both seizing the Crimea and not just confiscating certain geographic enclaves out of the Ukraine, but effectively cowing, intimidating the preponderance of Western Europe and to a degree the United States. It was as much as I dislike what they did there, and as much as I may dislike Vladimir Putin, although I'm sure he doesn't care what I think of him, I have to admire how effectively they employed a relatively small element to create outsized strategic results that won Russia substantial advantages in the contest of influence with the United States.
You want me to read to you the second question, or you got it?
No, I got it. I wrote it down. The most consequential thing I've seen over several administrations. Again, in a way, I've already alluded to this. And unfortunately, it's a negative consequence. We have been so inconsistent. I would argue over the last three administrations, Bush, Obama, and now Trump. We have been so inconsistent, in some cases wildly inconsistent, that in effect, we've convinced people in the Middle East we're unreliable. We didn't intend to be unreliable. We didn't go in there thinking, oh, we want a reputation for being the country you can't rely on.
Yeah.
But that's what we've essentially accomplished, despite our best intentions. our inability to stick with a consistent approach in the Middle East, in my humble opinion, has been the most consequential aspect of our foreign policy in the Middle East. Unfortunately, I end on a sour note here. It's an unfortunate consequence.
Yep. Mike, our time is up. I have abused your generosity. Thank you. This was really fun, and this was also extremely insightful. Hopefully, we could do it again at some point. Welcome aboard once again to the
Thank
MEI
you.
family. Really appreciate having you on. And any final thoughts on your part?
Oh, my final thoughts is that as I think I told you in a call earlier, 2 weeks ago, I passed the 1-year anniversary of my retirement from active duty. So, I'm still on my journey to try to learn how to become a competent civilian. It'll probably take me a few more years, but events like this, which caused me to reflect on the road I've had to walk, for better or for worse, for almost 4 decades, are cathartic for me. So I thank you for that. But also, I genuinely do hope that you, your colleagues, and at least a few people in the audience got some value from what I held forth on for this last hour plus. If that's the case, then I feel richly rewarded for the time I invested. Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're grateful, Mike. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. Really appreciate it. Stay safe.